I'm really excited that my good friend Cliff from graduate school and fellow psychologist has agreed to join me for a few episodes on this podcast to tackle different aspects of identity. And we're going to begin by talking about race and why it's so difficult to have conversations around something that's so important and that needs to be talked about in our country today. So I hope you enjoy. If you're like me, you know your mind can be your best or your worst friend. Our mind is an amazing tool that can do incredible things, but our mind can also create problems out of nowhere. Sometimes our mind keeps recommending the same solutions to problems even when they aren't working. I see this pattern play out as individuals try to overcome their anxiety, depression, or even struggles with pornography, using approaches that make sense but aren't very helpful. This podcast will show you how real researchers and clinicians are changing the way we approach mental health and reveal helpful research-supported principles designed to help real people with real problems. My name is Dr. Cameron Staley, and welcome to the Life After Series Radio. Hey everybody, I'm with my good buddy, Cliff. Man, how long have we known each other, Cliff?
Ooh, since 2008, 12 years.
Good memory, 12 years. So Cliff and I, we went to graduate school together. He just started the year after me in our clinical psychology program. And probably one of my favorite memories, or probably maybe the biggest reason why I was able to get through that program was 3 nights a week. Cliff would come over and we'd lift weights in our garage and we'd talk about cognitive psychology and the things we were learning in diversity and kind of go through all the articles and support each other, maybe complain a little bit. And that was my favorite outlet. Lift some weights, chat about what we're learning. And one thing I really appreciated about Cliff is it didn't matter the idea or the concept. You were always like so open. Like I've never experienced you as this defensive. You're just like curious about the world.
I think if you picked on me, I'd get defensive. But
Really? Oh,
um,
you got some
yeah,
buttons I can poke at?
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, if we're talking about big picture topics or about the world or about people in general, yeah, I just like to think about those things and explore ideas and concepts.
And I realized kind of with where things are in the world, um, this is an opportunity for growth. And I've seen maybe more at this point in my life. I've got some areas of growth that need to take place. And one of those is around race. And honestly, thinking back to graduate school, we took a diversity class and we read articles about different ethnic groups and how to be culturally sensitive. And I remember reading a book by Sue, and one of his claims in that book is if you're white, you're a racist. I remember
Hmm.
thinking like, that's messed up. Like, you don't even know me. Like, how could you call me a racist?
Yeah,
And I
it
was
doesn't
able to
feel
kind of
fair.
work through that, wrap my mind around it, and I felt like I was good to go until the last few months. With just a lot more awareness around race and Black Lives Matter and these shootings. And I realized I know like a teaspoon of this ocean around race, and I probably need to get learning.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying in terms of you and me have even had classes like college level, graduate level classes on these topics, and we still know very, very little. And so, in that sense, it doesn't surprise me that it's so hard for our society to have conversations around these topics. And it's so hard for us to be open and hear people's perspectives. And you and I are not immune to that. Sometimes we have a hard time when we hear people whose ideas are very divergent from our own. But yeah, I think that's why you and I are going to have these conversations. We're going to fumble through it and we're going to sound like idiots and we're going to show off our ignorance. But that's sort of our point in doing this is wanting to um, embark on a journey of trying to learn and understand ourselves better and try to learn and understand other people better. And if we can do this and put it out there for other people to listen to, and maybe it makes them feel a little bit safer to take their own risks and have their own difficult dialogue, then that's great. If even one person does that from this, then awesome. we've accomplished what we hoped to accomplish by showing off how little we know.
What we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's our disclaimer is, you know, we're going to chat about race, but I don't feel like an expert. But I do feel a tremendous amount of responsibility to learn about this and to challenge myself and to push myself. And there's feels like a lot of division within our country right now around a lot of topics, but particularly race. And I think part of that is we're uncomfortable talking about that, exploring it, taking perspectives. And I think when I'm in a counseling room with somebody and I'm listening and being empathic, I'm able to enter somebody's worldview a lot better. But I've noticed like when I'm talking with my like extended family or my neighbors or see people on social media, my walls go up and I get so defensive and reactive. And it's like, how could you even do that? And it's like I feel like a different person interacting with people outside of my little safe counseling room where I'm a lot more understanding and patient.
Yeah, I think we have those roles, and we've trained ourselves to be really empathic and non-judgmental and to see the world through their lens when you're in the counseling room, but you're also a person too. And when you interact with your extended family and your neighbors, you're just Cameron Staley. You're not being a therapist in that moment.
It's way harder for me. I prefer that kind of therapist role, but I think about like how important it is to be able to have these conversations because this aspects of our identity directly impact our mental health and our ability to navigate these conversations and form relationships and take perspective is a hallmark of good mental health. And I've realized as these opportunities have come up with family members or neighbors or friends and things like race comes up, I find myself getting really anxious and I can feel my heart pounding and I get nervous and it feels unsafe, even
Mm-hmm.
though it's not unsafe.
Not
In
physically
most cases,
dangerous.
it's unsafe. You should not talk about race, but
Yeah.
the reality is uncomfortable for me. But my mind tricks me. It's like, it's not safe. You shouldn't talk about this.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to your point about mental health, I remember like my first year of grad school, we read an article about depression. And so this is probably outdated research now, but I remember the number one predictive factor for whether or not someone would have subsequent major depressive episodes was how much social support they had in their life at that time. Which, if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. Like, we all have emotional needs, we all face challenges. But if you have a lot of supportive relationships in your life, it makes it a lot easier to navigate those challenges. And I think that makes it all the more important that we as a society learn how to have conversations around identities like race. Because, as you said a minute ago, our society is so divisive right now, and there's so much disconnection. And if we can't have a conversation about something like race, it just breeds more disconnection. And ultimately, long term, if we want to be healthy and we want to be connected and have good mental, emotional well being, we've got to be able to dialogue with each other. And sometimes people we disagree with aren't people we interact with on a regular basis, or sometimes it's your father in law, or it's your own brother or sister, or, you know.
Honestly, I'm already starting to feel myself anxious. Like, let's just keep talking around the topic and not address it head on. But I know as we've talked about having these chats, the thing that I keep coming back to, it's like we're a couple of white guys. Like, what do we know about race? And I think the honest answer is not much because I never really had to learn about it. I think coming as a white person, I've had a tremendous amount of privilege where I never really had to consider my race as I enter a doctor's office or education or apply for work or date. It's been a non-issue. So I think because of that, my development has been pretty stunted because I didn't really need to grow, at least with this part of my identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know for me, like, up until the last few years when I've actually begun to learn a little bit about these things, my whole life up till then, it was like I didn't think that race was in the room with me
Hmm.
until a person of color walked in.
Oh,
Like, I could be in a room of 10 people or 100 people, and there was no conscious awareness of race or racial identity. But then if a person of color walked in, it's like, oh, now race is present. And that in of itself just shows how unaware as a white person I was of this. Because the reality is, anytime I'm in a room, even if I'm in the room by myself, race is there because my whiteness is there. But I never thought of it that way. I never was aware of my own whiteness as a racial identity.
But is it Cliff? Is whiteness a racial identity? Because sometimes it seems like the non-identity. So is that like a subtle way to not deal with race, or is whiteness really a racial identity?
Well, so I would argue, yes, that whiteness is a racial identity. I think I haven't looked at this in a long time, but from an American perspective, we tend to categorize like five racial groups.
Mm.
And so white would be one racial group, black would be another, and then Latino would be another, Asian, and then Native American. And so in America, when we're talking about race, usually we are boiling things down into those five categories.
Mm.
And in order to say like diversity, you're talking about difference, you're talking about differences. So if you're talking about racial difference, well, different from what? People of
Mm.
color are different from what? Well, they're different from white people. And so you have white has to be a racial identity. Otherwise, people of color aren't different from anything.
Oh. Even when you say white and racial identity, I feel like Cliff, you can't say that. You can't name whiteness as a race. Like that's
What?
not.
Well,
It just feels like it violates like the social agreement that we have that we're not going to talk about race. We're not going to talk about being white. This isn't polite dinner conversation, and I think that's part of our challenge. Is it's like this unspoken rule where we actually can't use these kind of terms to talk about this.
yeah. Yeah, well, and think about it. I mean, for me as a white person, and I'm assuming for you as a white person, growing up in our households, like when did your parents ever say to you something about your racial identity or your whiteness as a racial identity? Like that literally never happened for me. Sometimes in my household, we would have a conversation about race, but it was only if the discussion was on a person of color and how they had a racial identity.
Yeah, that's been true for me for sure. I've never talked about it unless it's someone that looks different than me.
Hmm.
And I think about like I grew up in neighborhoods and attended schools with people that were mostly white, that
Hmm.
looked a lot like me and kind of thought a lot like me. And I think there's a sense of comfort in that, but also in that environment, there's not a lot of opportunities to grow and learn and have these kind of dialogues when everybody appears to look and think like you.
Right. Yeah, and same for me. You grew up in Utah, I grew up in Oregon. I grew up in a suburb of Portland. It was predominantly white, like 90 some percent probably for when I was born. And then it got a little bit more diverse, but I'll bet when I graduated high school, it was still like 85% white. The city I grew up in, the high school I grew up in. And there were a total of maybe like 4 or 5 students that were black in my graduating class of like 450 students.
Wow. I think it's probably similar to me. Like, I don't think I honestly thought about race until college. And I remember Juan Williams, he came and he was a speaker, and I had to go attend a speaker for like an assignment in a class. And I'm like, oh, I've heard of Juan Williams. He's on TV, he's famous. And he talked about white privilege. And I had
Oh wow.
never heard of that concept before. I was probably a junior in college, so like in my mid 20s. And I'm like, white privilege? I don't even know what that means. And now privilege is a big word, and people, it's probably a pretty polarizing word. But I think at that moment it hit me where it's like, whoa, like just because of being white, I might have other opportunities, or I might have some kind of barriers already removed for me just because of my skin color. And I had honestly never thought about that concept before till I was in my mid 20s.
I I think you were ahead of me because I don't think I ever understood that you could apply the words privilege and oppression to concepts of identity like race or gender until we were taking our graduate level
Oh,
diversity
really?
class. Yeah.
Even coming from a place like Portland?
Yeah. Well, that's funny you bring that up. So I have a bone to pick with the Pacific Northwest in terms of like the mentality that it's so liberal and progressive. Because I agree that politically it's very liberal and progressive, but when I was growing up there was no advocacy for people of color. And if you look at Portland and you look at other parts of Oregon, first of all, it's incredibly white. And then secondly, my own family is very liberal and progressive, most of my family members, and they would advocate for openness and acceptance of others and, um, wanting everybody to live free and be the way they want to be. But when it comes to advocacy, like where do you put your time, your energy, your money? I didn't know any liberal progressive
Mm,
people when I was growing up that did anything around racial advocacy. And when I became a teenager, there was starting to be some noticeable advocacy around the LGBTQ
yeah.
population. And I thought that was great. And I thought, yeah, this is awesome. We should support people regardless of their sexuality. If it's not hurting someone, why is it a problem? But even then, there was still no advocacy around racial identity and racial oppression, institutional, systemic oppression due to race. So I don't know if that's because most of the white or most of the liberal progressive people in the Pacific Northwest are white and they're just unaware. Like maybe they didn't even realize that, racial oppression was an issue. But I also can't help but wonder if, like, just like you and I have said tonight, that talking about race isn't okay. So what would it have been like in the year 2000 or 1995 for some white people to go out and like hold signs and advocate for people of color,
Yeah.
which is what white people have been doing the last few months in certain places in the country with everything that's been going on. But imagine 20 or 25 years ago, white people doing that. Like, we can hardly have conversations about race today. I just think that that's part of it, is that a lack of awareness in the first place, but then also it's taboo to discuss. So how are you going to go out and do public advocacy around it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, racism, even though I know about it and I think about like any acts of violence or discrimination, I mean, those are really evil and wrong. And so I'm like, well, I don't do that, so I don't have to worry about that. But I think racism is so big and pervasive that I just haven't seen it. And where things like you mentioned LGBT issues, that for me was a lot easier to detect or detect. How do you say that
Detect.
word? Detect. Thank you. Growing up in a really religious kind of community, there's a lot more focus around sexuality, and I could be like, oh wait, here's people that need advocacy work and support and allies. And I had a lot of kind of energy and motivation and passion for sexual orientation. When it came to race, I'm like, well, I'm not a racist. I'm good to go. And then I'd say the last few months, that mentality is completely like just been blown up. Where I think about like even my own history and what I've learned about our country, I'm like, I don't think I really understand my history well. So this is where this is maybe my confession moment. So whatever TV subscription we have, they had a lot more offerings for different documentaries and movies related to like Black history. And I saw one called Selma, and I'd never seen Selma. And I'm like, oh, I wonder who Selma was. She must have been some famous woman or something. And then I watched Selma, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that was a pivotal march led by Martin Luther King about voting rights in the South. I thought that was probably some woman. Like I had never heard of Selma. And I'm an educated adult that cares
Yeah.
about these issues. I never heard of that show, never watched it before. And I watched it and it's like, whoa, like these protests in the 60s feel really similar to what's going on now. And it wasn't until they started recording them on TV that people around the country were like, this is bad. Like, this is wrong. Like, people are dying over race. And I think we saw that a lot with George Floyd, that was the tipping point, that it was recorded in such a callous, brutal way where it's like, whoa, what is going on? You just can't ignore that anymore. And I felt like I didn't even know Selma was a thing.
Hmm.
That was shocking to me. And then recently, John Lewis passed away. And he's someone who's been a civil rights advocate his whole life. And as I started to read more about him, I didn't even connect that he was in that march in Selma. I had just
Yeah.
watched that show. I'm like, oh, wait, like this icon in Congress was also there with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, and I read his final words in that op-ed, and it was just incredible. Like his call to arms and call for peace and action and democracy and movement. And I thought, I've really never heard of him before.
Hmm.
And he's been doing this for decades. And I thought, how could I be this far along in my life and never heard of him? And I think it's because, well, I didn't really have to. I didn't really have to learn about Selma or John Lewis, or I know of Martin Luther King, but as far as these movements, and that John Lewis has still been like fighting the fight for all these years, I never really knew who he was. It feels pretty. I feel really small admitting that, but I also may not be the only white person that's just not that familiar with these people from our history.
Yeah, yeah. I think the vast majority of people who identify as white and are perceived as white by society um, would have equal things to admit to what you just admitted. And I've had conversations with people recently around like, oh, I've read White Fragility, or I've read So You Want to Talk About Race, or I've read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and I like, why wasn't this information available 20 years ago or 30 years ago? And I think that is also part of our ignorance as white people, because like you just said, you were never in a position where you were forced to learn about John Lewis or to need to know about Selma. And I think it's the same thing. Like a lot of the concepts that a lot of us white people are learning about today have been around for a
Yeah, they're
long
not
time.
new.
Yeah, they're not new. They feel new to us. They're new to us, but that's not because they haven't existed previously. It's because we've not sought them out. It's because the majority of white people in America have not needed to know this information, and they didn't have any personal benefit to knowing the information, and therefore they didn't seek it out, even though it's existed for a long time.
Ready for another confession, Cliff?
Sure.
These feel like, oh gosh, why am I doing this? But that's what we're here for. And I think about like the last couple months, I've done more reading and reflecting and research around race than I've done my whole life.
Hmm.
And I honestly feel like a child in this. And I thought about John Lewis's life and the
Hmm.
things that he accomplished and the things that he stood for at such an early age. And when I read his final words, I read him multiple times. It's coming up for me again. It's been a long time since I've been moved by something so powerful. And I think I get uh, nauseated by politics,
Hmm.
rhetoric on both
Hmm.
sides.
Hmm.
And John Lewis's final words were so powerful and pure. I felt like I wanted to proclaim these.
Hmm.
And my first instinct, this is what we do, is like, I'm going to share this on my social media.
Yeah.
But my next thought was like, oh, what if my friends are uncomfortable with me sharing something about John Lewis?
Hmm.
And I actually had to sit there. It's like, think about his life. He risked his life, I don't know how many times, to advocate for racial awareness and equality. And here I am as a white person. It's like, well, I don't know if I want to push send on his final words because what if people don't like it?
Hmm.
Or what if I get unfriended or someone has
Hmm.
a hard time? And I thought, wow, like I had just finished reading White Fragility, where it's like, maybe white folks are a little underdeveloped in this area and they're a little fragile. Like they can't have these conversations very effectively. And I'm like, yeah, probably. And then here I am in this moment where it's like, this is fragility. I am moved to tears reading his words and scared to share this because most of my friends are white like me and they might not like it.
Yeah.
And that felt really crappy to acknowledge that. And within 10 minutes, being aware of that and thinking about it, I'm like, dude, it's time to grow. Like,
Hmm.
share this with the world. It's okay if people don't like it or attack you. Like, he moved you, his life moved you. This matters. It's time to grow. But that was, yeah, just shocking how uncomfortable that was for me with the contrast of how moving and powerful his words really were.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such a good example of a couple of things that I don't know what the right word is for it, if it's fear or apprehension, reservation, but we, like that example you gave, you were feeling something emotional and it was trying to hold you back. It was trying to tell you, don't press send, don't put this out there, don't ruffle feathers. And I think that is a huge barrier for all of us as white people or privileged people to push forward and move society in the direction that it ultimately needs to go if it's going to become healthier and kinder and more equitable.
Mm.
We as individuals have to push through those moments when our emotions try to hold us back. And I think we experience that due to our privilege, that we know it's going to get some pushback if we put it out there. And we've been taught, don't do things that get pushback. And I think that's one of the main reasons that we haven't, as a society, we haven't made more progress on these issues in the past 50, 60 years, is because each of us as individuals, we don't want to ruffle feathers. We don't want to do something that gets pushback because we know it's not polite or you're not supposed to or whatever. But that is also exactly how our privilege as white people stays institutionalized.
And it's so pervasive. Everything you just said, like, it made me think about our community, and our university
Mm-hmm.
organized a peaceful march. So a couple of our athletes reached out to the local police officers and say, "Hey, let's march together." And I'm like, "Let's go." And I have this chat with my partner, and she's like, "I don't think we should. It probably won't be safe."
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah, we could easily be like, "Yeah, let's not go. Like, it,
Mm-hmm.
it might be dangerous for us."
Mm-hmm.
And that feels like such a position of privilege where I can really care about this issue of equality, but also I can also not march,
Mm-hmm.
and my kids are still okay. And I wrestle with that where it's like I don't need to march, but it feels like it's something that is so right and is so needed. But also there's not like I don't need to. It's easier, and I don't like that piece, because I'm just not used to putting myself into situations that feel less than like 100% safe.
Yeah.
And that march was very safe. It was very well organized, and we have a great community. And I missed out on that night, that opportunity. But I think about how many opportunities there are like that, where it's like I really care about this, just like you said in your community growing up. But white folks, you can really care about it and also not do anything about it.
Right.
And for me, it's not enough for me to be aware of these issues and privileges and disadvantages. If I don't do anything, I don't know if that awareness matters a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that's part of the challenge, and I think that's. Um, I had a colleague of mine say something about. Um, I don't know. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was in reference to George Floyd being murdered in the street, and then the way white people kind of responded to that, and it
Mm.
said, "Black people get murdered in the street, so white people join book clubs."
Oh,
And I think there's a lot of validity to that in two ways. Like, I think white people saw George Floyd's murder and they said, that's not okay. It is unacceptable that that happened. And I need to be a part of the solution. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to educate myself because I need some more education. So, how do I educate myself? I'm going to buy these books. I'm going to join a book club. I'm going to read. I'm going to learn, you know, so I think there's the intention, of course, is really good in white people's response in that way. But I think there's still a lot to be taken away from that. That every white person in America could read 10 books and become way more aware as an individual about racial equality. That's not going to change anything.
mm.
White people being aware in of itself, yeah, that doesn't change policies. It doesn't change laws. It doesn't change police practices. So I think that is the really hard part. And then for each of us as like you and me, we want to see ourselves as advocates for racial equality. But what does that mean? What does that look like? And to me, advocacy requires action. And what actions are you taking to make change? And educating yourself, I think, is a necessary piece of the process,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's sufficient for actual change.
I feel like you're talking about me, Cliff.
I'm
'Cause that was,
talking about both of us.
that's where I started. I'm like, I'm gonna get a book. That's what I do. Where it's like, I don't know enough about this topic. I'm uncomfortable. I'm gonna do my research. And I honestly like reading like White Fragility. I started there
Mhm,
because my neighbor had a copy and I couldn't get a print. She
mhm,
also has How to Be an Anti-Racist, but she was reading that one. I'm like, oh, I want to read that one next. But honestly, reading that book, I felt better. And it almost like satisfied some of that discomfort where I'm like, oh, I'm
Yep.
good. Like
Yep.
I'm more aware, more educated. And I'm like, no, you can't stop there. But I think about getting educated and increasing your awareness is where we need to start. I mean, that is a big step. And I think for me, before I could do any advocacy work or actually stick my neck out there, I need to learn more about it because I'm just not well versed around race. And I'm honestly, I feel really clumsy having these conversations. And
Yeah.
as we thought about like maybe recording some of these chats, I thought, who are we to do this, Cliff? Like
Mm,
we are not experts on race.
no.
I could talk about anxiety or unwanted pornography concerns or depression. I could say I am an expert on treating those mental health conditions. And I feel really safe talking about those. I can talk about those all day. I can talk about emotions all day.
Hmm.
But when it comes to aspects of identity and specifically race, I feel like you should be learning from anybody but me. But then it also like takes away all the responsibility I have on my part to actually learn and grow. And so I just want someone to teach me, but I don't want to do the growing. And so part of this is like I need to challenge myself to have these chats to get more comfortable. But I still feel so young in this process.
Yeah. You brought up so many good points. There's so many good things we can talk about with that. Um, one of which that I'll try to keep quick is so Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, he was on a TED Talk or something that was like published by the people who published the TED Talks, I guess. And what he said just floored me. It blew my mind because they were talking to him about the response to George Floyd and
Mm,
about like something along the lines of, how much meaningful change will come about due to George Floyd's murder and the other murders of Black people that have happened recently and made headlines and stuff. And he is so smart because he said that he doesn't really know what kind of change will come from this because what is ultimately going to determine that is what white people need to do to emotionally feel better.
oh,
So you see the footage of George Floyd be murdered, it doesn't sit right with most of us
right.
emotionally. And we just feel terrible. It feels wrong. It feels like something needs to be done to make the world feel better. And so I think that's what a lot of us have done as white people. We join a book club, we read a book, and just like you said about White Fragility, you read that book and then you're like, okay, I feel a bit better about
I did.
myself, about my circumstances, and about my role in moving forward in society. And I think Ibram X. Kendi nailed it on the head because if every white person who was disturbed by George Floyd's murder goes and reads a book and feels better, they're gonna stop acting. They're gonna stop advocating because that fire has sort of been quenched for them, and
Yeah.
so they don't feel that same pressure and need to take more action to make things different and better. And every white person reading the book does not automatically result in policy change, societal change, more equity, etc., like we were talking about. So I think he's just 10 times smarter than you or me.
Oh yeah.
And he I think he's right on with that, and that's part of our journey as advocates is like, what does that mean to us, and where does that role stop, and what does that role look like? I also am thinking though, to totally jump topics, like you and I are talking as two white people who believe in racial equity and believe in white privilege and believe that there is institutional oppression of people of color in our country. But what do we say to people who don't believe those things? Like, what
Mm.
if your listeners right now, or some of your listeners right now, don't believe in any of that? How do we connect to them?
Um, I'm a psychologist. I ask the questions, Cliff. I don't answer the questions. Because yeah, I honestly don't know. Because I've had those conversations with people, neighbors and family, and we've talked about Black Lives Matter, and a lot of my neighbors who I care about that are good people, they're like, I don't get this movement. I don't understand it. I don't see the purpose. All lives matter. I think this is a Marxist movement. And it's like, it feels like in a really different place than maybe how I view these concerns and the importance and significance of those. And I think it could be really easy for me to be like, well, you just haven't seen the light yet, or you need to read this book, or I went to school, and so I know more. I think we really easily shut other people down if they're at a different part in their kind of life or journey. And everyone's experiences are so different. And honestly, I think about like if I would have chose a different career, like say I followed my dad and was a mechanical engineer, I don't know if I would see the purpose behind Black Lives Matter. I don't. I probably wouldn't have read White Fragility or even heard of the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. I don't think any of that would have mattered. And I think my profession has kind of put me in situations where I've interacted with people that are very different than myself, that didn't have the same opportunities and experiences I've had. And these are people of color, sexual, gender minorities, people with disabilities, on autism spectrum, you name it, where it's like in those moments we're slowing things down and I'm trying to understand their worldview and experiences. And it's like, whoa, what you've gone through is really different than me and you're hurting. And these movements mean so much and there's so much needed. And I don't think without those hundreds of experiences in a therapy room, I don't know if race would mean a whole lot to me. And I think about that too when I'm having these conversations with people. It's like, I get it. I grew up in a similar context and race was irrelevant. And now that I've interacted with so many people and connected and deeply care about others that are different than me, it's not irrelevant anymore. I still might not know a whole lot, but I know it's important. So I do think about that quite a bit as I'm having these chats with people that don't even consider privilege or race as an issue or their role in it, that I probably wouldn't be too different than them if I would have had a different profession.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me too, like as I mentioned, I was in graduate school before I ever understood that privilege and oppression applied to things like race or gender. And yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I also know that for me, it took having mentors in the field
Mm,
of psychology. Um, most of, well, specific people who mentored me around race and racial identity. And most of them were people of color. And they were patient enough and empathic enough and kind enough to meet me where I was at and to help me take a step forward in my journey of understanding. Because I mean, I'm just kind of thinking like I could have sat in the therapy room with people of color and heard about their experiences and felt bad, but my brain would have been able to write those things off
mm.
as like anomalies or exceptions.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, like this one person, they, were called a bad name by a white person, but that's just like one bad apple and every bushel has its bad apples. My brain would not have made the connection of, no, this isn't just one anomaly. Like these experiences are pretty universal. And so
Yeah.
this one person's experience is representative of the experiences of a lot of people of color. And what that shows us is that these issues, racism, oppression, it is systemic throughout our society. It's not something where we get to just say, oh, yeah, there's one old mean racist in every community, but they'll die in 10 years. And so we don't need to do anything about this. Like, in a way, that'd be great if that was the situation. Um, but if it wasn't for these mentors who helped me see the bigger picture, the broader societal view of it, I still don't think that just getting to know those individuals and their experiences, that would have been enough to cue me in or clue
Yeah.
me in.
And I'm super curious about that, Cliff, because I've been relatively sheltered. I've stayed in the Intermountain West in Utah, Idaho, and I lived in the Midwest, St. Louis for a couple of years. But when you grew up in Portland, you went to school in Texas, you've been to Georgia, you've been to Kansas, like you've lived international. Like I'm curious how living in those different areas and having different mentors has helped you see this bigger picture.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's not like, obviously, I'm not some expert in these sorts of topics or theories broadly, but in terms of my own experience, living abroad, I studied abroad as a junior in college for a few months, and I went to Spain and lived with a host family. And doing that, what it taught me, I came home and told my friends and my parents about how like it taught me that there are 20 right ways to do everything. So
Huh.
like there's 20 right ways to make a breakfast in the morning. There's 20 right ways to tie your shoes. Like there's 20 right ways to define what a sandwich is. Because when you go and you immerse yourself in another culture, you realize, oh, yeah, they eat meals throughout the day, but the things they eat and how they eat them and how they prepare them is totally different.
Huh.
And it's right for them. And so my right way is not everybody else's right way. So that was really like the take home message for me about living abroad and being immersed in another culture is that the way that I prefer or works best for me is not going to be the way that works best for everybody else. And that's totally okay. But it really didn't do anything for me in terms of awareness of identities and
Hmm.
privilege and oppression and that sort of thing. And another factor I think there is that I studied abroad in Spain, which is a developed country, it's Western Europe. So yes, it's very different from the United States in a lot of ways, but it's also not nearly as different from the United States as if I had gone maybe to somewhere in South America or
Hmm.
Africa or something like that.
Yeah. But you've lived like in the South, like Texas, Georgia, Kansas, probably not the South, but Midwest.
Yeah.
Like, how were those experiences for you coming from kind of Oregon area?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Undergrad, I was still very sheltered because
Mm.
I went to a small private liberal arts school, and so there was about 7,000 students when I went to TCU. I graduated from there in 2007.
7,000. Wow, that's small.
Yeah, yeah, and predominantly white. Like when I was in undergrad, if I saw a student who was black walking across campus, my brain just assumed they were on an athletic scholarship
Wow.
because like, why would you want to come to a school that's 98% white if you're black? I would just assume you wouldn't necessarily, and maybe that's a wrong assumption. Um, but yeah, when I would see a student that was black, my brain just assumed that they were an athlete.
Hmm.
Um, and I think part of that shows too well, it shows a lot of things, all of which are negative about me and my brain's assumptions. But part of that too is that it was an expensive school, and I
Oh,
think growing up, my brain didn't associate people of color with being able to afford going to an expensive school. And
wow.
so that's super messed up. And that's sad that my brain made that assumption. But my experience at TCU was so insulated from the real world as a
Hmm.
private liberal arts school that I don't think it really expanded my mind a whole lot. Didn't really give me a lot of opportunities to be pushed and challenged to grow
Yeah.
in those ways, especially related to race or sexual orientation, that kind of thing. Um, and then in terms of my brain and the assumptions it makes, unfortunately, it's not gotten all that much better, maybe because just today I was at work and I was in the front way, like the front entryway of a building on our campus, and a student walked by and I said good morning to him. And when I saw them, they were small in stature. They appeared to be male identified, and they appeared to be like Latino or maybe Hispanic. And when they said good morning back to me, my brain was surprised that they didn't have an accent.
Wow.
And as I say that, I wonder if some of your listeners are like, if that just makes sense to them. And I wonder if some of your listeners are appalled
Huh.
because once I realized, like, oh gosh, my brain was just surprised that they didn't have an accent when they responded to me. That's really sad to me that my brain is making assumptions about this person's, accent as it relates to speaking English or speaking other languages. It's sad that my brain makes those types of assumptions and can't just allow this person to be what they are and who they are without those assumptions. But it's definitely based on their stature and their skin color, my brain's perception of their racial identity and ethnicity that caused my brain to make that assumption. And the reason I bring that up here is because to acknowledge that my brain still does this stuff, even though I've spent the last better
Yeah.
part of a decade trying to teach my brain not to do that sort of thing. But also because that's, in my mind, that's a perfect example of how our biases and our prejudices play out in every day. I said good morning to a lot of other students, and my brain didn't assume that
Hmm.
any of those other students would have an accent. but it did with that one student.
Oh,
Those are the types of assumptions that I think we all make, even well-meaning, good-intentioned white people. Our brains are all doing that sort of thing on a regular basis.
I appreciate you sharing that, Cliff. Like, part of me, as you're talking about, I'm like, oh, don't admit that stuff, Cliff. But you're right. Like, it's so automatic and so universal and relatable. And I think what you said made me think about Ibram X. Kendi, where he talks about you're either racist or anti-racist. There's no not racist. And I think I've always put myself in the not racist group, where it's like, I'm not racist. But I think what you mentioned illustrates that. Like, we have those assumptions and biases and predictions and lack of awareness over privilege. And that kind of puts us more in that racist camp. But that word is so loaded, where we associate racists with people that are running people down and throwing things at people of color and doing terrible, awful things. And it's like, well, I'm not that, so I'm not a racist. But I think it is a lot more subtle and a lot more universal. But I think admitting that is really uncomfortable, where it's like, I do not want to be associated with someone who's a racist. And yet, as you talked about all those things, it's like, yeah, my brain kind of does that too. And so one thing I've appreciated, I think when Kendi first brought up that concept of being an anti-racist, my mind kind of went boom, where I'm like, I don't even know what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even understand that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have to simplify things for myself. And to be an anti-racist is someone who can admit those kind of racist assumptions that we have or automatic reactions and be like, wow, yeah, I have that. I can own that. I can take responsibility for us. And that's how we can be an anti-racist. And that's really what I'm striving for in this moment. I didn't even know that was an option like 2 months ago. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I don't even know like what I'm hoping people get out of our conversations, Cliff, or if they get anything out of this. But one thing I do hope is that people can maybe have some permission to have some chats and to make some mistakes and acknowledge that, yeah, we probably do things that make us feel uncomfortable, and we can still be trying our best and still have a lot to learn. And if people listening to this don't get any of that, then honestly, this is something that's going to help me grow. And I feel like I need to. I feel like I have a responsibility to my clients that I serve in a mental health context, but also my children. I feel like I want to raise them with more awareness and to be anti-racist. And I'm still trying to figure out what that even is fully. And so it feels like a big undertaking, but it feels like something I definitely want to travel. So I hope what we share is helpful. Um, but it does feel awkward to be like, we're not experts in this. So listen to a couple white guys talk about things we don't really know that much about. But I think there's a lot of folks in our camp where we don't feel like we know enough, so we don't talk about it. And then none of us grows and we're stuck and nothing changes. And so I do want things to change and improve for everybody. And so if that requires me stumbling and saying things that are incorrect or unhelpful or offensive, I hope that as I receive feedback from people, that I can take that in and improve. But I also recognize I'll probably be pretty defensive and be like, I disagree with you. And
Yeah.
then I hope, as I am aware of that, that I can still ingest that feedback and improve. Because that's my hope, is to learn and be better. And I think the last few months with, I think just the stress of the pandemic and then kind of tension around race on top of that, and I'll put us all in a position of, I felt a lot more exposed, where people's views are just out there a lot more because you just can't hide anymore. And it's like, gosh, I just feel like this is an area I just don't know enough. And in the world we live in, that's not okay. That it's time to learn. And I think that responsibility falls on me. And oh, this ain't gonna look pretty, Cliff, but I hope that we can keep talking about aspects of identity, like sexual orientation and religion and politics. Things were like, whoa, don't talk about that. That ain't polite conversation. But I feel like if we don't talk about it, our division in this country is gonna get wider. And like, I want to talk about these issues with people that see it very differently than me.
Mhm.
Their experiences are valid and meaningful, and I can learn from that. But often I'm like, I'll just talk to my colleagues that see things like me, but then nobody grows. So I hope people watch this, find some things like, yeah, I relate to that. That's helpful. And others, it's like, that's complete BS. That's ridiculous. Like, I feel like that's still healthy for our mental health, just to practice listening to these conversations and managing some of that conflict within us, I think is ultimately going to be helpful for us.
Mhm. Yeah, I totally agree. I have the same hopes as you. And I do hope that people give us feedback and share their comments and their perspectives, regardless of where they fall on that spectrum in terms of, does this matter? Is it important? It's super important. Um, and if, one of us gets feedback that causes us to be really defensive, that's where the other one of us comes in to help us maintain some perspective and say, well, hold on, let's try to understand where this person's coming from. Because yeah, you and I are going to get triggered and be defensive just like everybody else does. And yes, you and I are not experts. We are going to screw this up every step of the way. Um, but
Oh
yeah,
crap.
we'll
I think
do our
that's
best.
what we want. We want to do our best, and I think my intentions are good, but sometimes good intentions can still be harmful
Yeah,
for other people. And my hope
right.
with the Life After series podcast is we're sharing things that are helpful for mental health. But yeah, this is an area where it's like I'm not as well versed, but I think that's the purpose. And understanding more about ourselves and identity is so fundamental for having good quality mental health. And like you mentioned, having that social support that we need during times of heightened stress and tension. And I think about like some of us may have a hard time around race or not see privilege there or feel really disadvantaged. But if I think about all the complexities of our identity, there's always parts of us that has lots of advantages and parts of us that are pretty disadvantaged, but those are always so interchangeable depending on the individual you're talking to or kind of the constellation of who's in the room. So race may be challenging, but I think we're going to keep kind of working through this identity will and think about all of the parts that make us who we are. But I still feel like we need to spend a little bit more time on race because it is so big, and I honestly feel like the least equipped to talk about race. I prefer to talk about sexual orientation. I feel a lot more well versed there. But race, I feel like that's where I need the most help. So I kind of wanted to start there.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start, especially given the fact that it's so much on the I don't know, in the forefront for us societally right now too. I think it's very applicable. And you and I have maybe barely even scratched the surface, of what there is to discuss around this topic. So I think there's plenty for us to revisit the next time we chat.
Awesome. Well, this is fun, Cliff. It feels like we just got transported back to my garage 10 years ago, lifting weights, thinking, chatting. And I look forward to doing this a little more consistently with you, Cliff.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Hey, thanks for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe. I know you might be facing some issues in your life or know someone who is. Issues like anxiety, challenges in dealing with emotions, or other compulsive behaviors like unwanted pornography. And I know it's tough to talk to people about problems. Difficult to stare those obstacles down that we face in life and to really know how to deal with them. It's hard to know what to say and when to say it. And then when that moment you finally reach out to family and friends happens, sometimes it falls flat. I haven't found many programs teaching effective strategies like mindfulness, how to improve relationships, and ways to address unwanted pornography viewing through research-supported principles. So whether you simply want to help with a problem like unwanted pornography, difficulty responding to emotions, or just want to understand the world of someone struggling with porn a little better, head over to lifeafterpornography.com and get in on the next training. There you'll learn the exact same strategies individuals addicted to pornography used to transform their lives by implementing principles from evidence-based treatment shown effective in research for reducing unwanted pornography viewing. You'll learn the secrets, the myths, the enemies to recovery, and the LAP framework for dealing with unwanted porn viewing that we call WAVE. If that's something that interests you, click the link in the description or just head over to lifeafterpornography.com. I'm Dr. Cameron Staley. See you on the inside.